Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we will take a look at macros and we have left off in macros 1. Now before we dive into the exercise, I want to give you a brief overview. And macros in fact isn't something you will write a lot, but they can be pretty useful in some specific situations. So it's good that you know the basics about it. Now there are two types of macros: declarative macros and procedural macros. And the most common type is actually declarative macros, and they always start with the keyword macro rules exclamation mark, like that. Now you might wonder what is actually the difference between macros and functions. So let's see this sentence. Fundamentally, macros are a way of writing code that writes other code, which is known as meta-programming. All of these macros expand to produce more code than the code you have written manually. And metaprogramming is useful for reducing the amount of code you have to write and maintain, which is also one of the roles of functions. However, macros have some additional powers that functions don't. Now, for example, macros can take any amount of arguments, while functions have a fixed amount. So you can pass macros no argument, you can pass it 1, 2, 3, and so on. And this is also very important. Macros are expanded before the compiler interprets the meaning of the code. So a macro can, for example, implement a trait on a given type. A function can't, because it gets called at runtime and the trait needs to be implemented at compile time. So a function will get called at runtime, but macros are expanded, and I will show you what that means in a minute. Macros are expanded before the compiler interprets the meaning of the code. So one of the first things a compiler will actually do is expanding the macro. So let's see what this could look like. We have here the vec macro. You have seen this before. And over here you can see a simplified definition of the vec macro. So this is the name. As you can see, this is a declarative macro. We are exporting that so other crates can use it. And it just simply takes an expression multiple times, any time or any amount of time you wish, and then it takes this x over here that gets passed and it will just push it into the vector. Now this is how it's written in the library. Now compiler will come and check this and it will expand it. So before actually the program gets executed, this will get expanded and it will then look something like this, as you can see. So when we call the vec macro with these arguments, it will get expanded to this. So as you can see, we get arguments, we get an input, and then a macro basically just writes code. You don't have to write, you have to write at one time, and then it is used for every call to that specific macro. So you don't have to manually do it like that. And let's actually dive into the exercise. So we are inside macros 1, And as you can see, we have here a declarative macro. That's because we are using here the keyword macro rules, and this is the name of the macro, my macro. So this doesn't take any input, and it just prints out check out my macro. So as you can see, we have here a main function, and all it does, it calls this macro. Now you have seen a lot of macros before, like println, we have seen back, we have seen, I guess, format, and so on. Now, the one thing all of these have in common is the exclamation mark at the end of the name of the macro. So what's missing over here is that we don't have this exclamation mark. And when you add it, the code should compile, as you can see. And the output is check out my macro. And that's basically just the print line statement over here that gets executed when we call this macro. All right. Let's see the second one. And as you can see, we have actually the same thing. The same thing, we have a main function, my macro is called, and then over here we have again my macro, which just consists of one print line statement. So what's the problem over here? As you can see, cannot find macro, my macro in this scope. So as I've said, the compiler has to expand the macro, and that means it has to be at the beginning of the program, because this then will get expanded. And when we have it like that, it should actually compile. So let's see. And as you can see, same output. It's basically the same program. Third one. Now here we have a module called macros, and inside we have again the same macro, my macro, with a print line statement. And in main we are calling my macro. So the problem over here is that main function doesn't find this macro because it's not in the right scope. So this is inside module. So the easiest way to solve this is basically just delete the module. So as you can see, it's in the scope, and then main can find it like that. But if you want to have this inside a module, you have two ways to solve that. You can use macro use, as you can see, and macro use is basically just like you would write a use statement. As you've seen in the previous topics, we have always imported some stuff. So for example, use create test func. And then you can use it in this scope, and you can just call test func wherever you want in this program. So that's the first one. And the second one would be to just export this macro export like that. And it's basically the same thing. When you export the macro, that means that the macro can be used in different grades or different scopes, for example. And yeah, And I guess you can even just do both like that. All right. And we are in the last one. So over here we have a macro, my macro, and as you saw, all are declarative, and that's actually the most common way macros are written, with this keyword macro rules. And inside declarative macros you see we have like a match expression, and if there are no parameters over here, it will just print check out my macro. Now if there is an argument like that, as you can see, it will just print out the value. Look at this other macro and the value that gets passed over here, in this case 7777. Now this, okay, let's see. Okay, sorry for that. So this is basically just a syntax error, because after each expression you have to close it like that. You have to pass it semicolon. And as you can see, we have here check out my macro, and the second output, look at this other macro 7777, like that. Alright, that was it for macro. I hope this was useful, and we will go in the next topic to take a look at Clippy. See you then.